This morning, we're continuing our message series in Thanksgiving, and I wanted to go back to the Old Testament in Deuteronomy because I wanted to even out. I didn't want to just talk about New Testament encouragements to give thanks and praise, but there's also Old Testament encouragements, and I wanted to reflect on staying grounded in gratitude during times of abundance, like Mike shared today during the praise, and recognizing also the dangers of forgetting God when we experience plenty. I want to start the stage with a story that I wanted to share with you all. I don't know if you know this man. He goes by the name of Clement Stone. Anybody who grew up in Chicago might have heard of him. He grew up on the south side of Chicago in a very poor neighborhood. And in the 20s, there was a businessman by this name, Clement Stone, who made a fortune in the insurance industry. He was living a life of abundance. His company was booming, and his wealth seemed limitless. I mean, this guy had his hands on a lot of things. And as he became more successful, Stone started to forget the humble beginnings that had brought him to success. At the height of his prosperity, he felt invincible. It says he talks about in his book, and attributing his success entirely to his own ingenuity and his own effort. However, when the Great Depression struck in 1929, his company nearly collapsed. Stone lost almost everything he had worked so hard to build for, and his personal wealth evaporated overnight. In the midst of this crisis, Clement Stone actually had a spiritual awakening. Stone realized that his success had really been a gift from God, not solely the result of his own hard work. And so he remembered the people who had helped him along the way, especially his mother, and his early days of struggle and the guidance that he had received. As he started remembering all of these people in his life who helped him to get to where he ultimately became, this moment of humility and gratitude turned his life around. He rebuilt his life with a renewed sense of dependence upon God, and over time, his business actually recovered. So much so that by 1979, his company had over $1 billion in assets, and he had given to the church more than hundreds of millions of dollars back to God and to the church. But this time, his success was actually marked by humility, not by his own strength or power. And he always constantly acknowledged God for God's role in his blessings. See, the moral of Stone's story, ladies and gentlemen, is that it's really easy to forget God in times of abundance. And so when confronted with the reality of losing everything, I want to share with us through our sermon today that we can return to a place of gratitude. Just like the Israelites in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 10 through 17, we are warned to remember God in both times of prosperity and times of need. And so that our hearts can remain thankful, steadfast, and humble. So let's go to the Word of God in Deuteronomy chapter 8. As we open up our Bibles, please follow along the screen. This is what God says in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 10. When you have eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Be careful that you do not forget forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I am giving you this day. I want to give us the context of where Moses is sharing these words from God. They are actually, Deuteronomy is the book that Moses writes as the Israelites are heading into, crossing over into the Jordan, the promised land. And so these words in Deuteronomy are instructions from God to his people. And before they're about to experience the land of flowing milk, the land of honey, I mean, they're about to experience a really amazing change where they were always dependent on God's provision. Now they're going to be going into a land that is plentiful. And God here is trying to remind the Israelites, to address them, that as they enter into the land, don't forget to depend upon God. Because God is warning them that the abundance that they're about to go into can lead many times to forgetfulness. And so where people might start thinking that they achieved this prosperity and this blessing on their own. Now, this was more than 4,000 years ago, ladies and gentlemen, back when the Israelites were going into the land of flowing with milk and honey. But today, 4,000 years later, we're no different. I don't know about you, but many times when we are struggling, when we don't have much, when people like Clement Stone was selling newspapers because he was so poor, he was selling newspapers on the south side of Chicago. I'm sure that at those times, those chilly winter mornings, as he's freezing himself, but trying to make a buck, trying to sell newspapers, I'm sure that he had this healthy dependence upon God. And that's what his autobiography shows. That in earlier years of his life, they were so poor. His father, by the way, his father had died early. I believe when he was around 7 years old. And ever since then, Clement Stone had to be the father of the house. That's just the way things went in the 1900s. And so as he's trying to make a life for his mom, trying to support his mom and his brothers and sisters, his family members, I'm sure he had a healthy dependence upon God. But then once you make it rich, once you have plenty, once you have more than what you need, we start to forget. And we start to say things like, gee, you know what? I walked these past 40 years around Israel. It was my doing that got into this land of abundance. And people like Clement Stone could have said, you know, it was my ingenuity, it was my hard work, and that's why now that I'm rich, God didn't really, you tend to forget God. And so this is just natural human being nature. This is just the nature of human beings. We tend to forget in times of plenty that we actually had help along the way. And what God is trying to tell the Israelites back then, 4,000 years ago, is that when you're about to cross into this plentiful land, don't forget me. Don't forget the abundant blessings. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God. That is what God is trying to tell these Israelites. And we can also see it similarly, a way for God to be telling us today. The next verse. Why is he warning the Israelites to not forget him? Because there's a temptation. There's the danger of pride. Let's go into verse 12. He says here in verse 12, otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. See, the second point here that I'm trying to make is that there is a danger. There is a danger of pride and self-reliance when we come into abundance. Here in this verse, in verse 13, Moses mentions how the Israelites will start having flocks and herds and silver. These blessings can become sources of pride and self-sufficiency. And so the key point that God is trying to make here is that wealth and abundance can actually shift dependence from Him, from God, to oneself, leading to spiritual complacency. And once again, this happened with that gentleman by the name of Clement Stone. He had had this healthy dependence upon God on his way up to his riches. But then once he got to a certain point, he started to forget God, and spiritually he started to become complacent. You know, we can actually see this phenomenon in today's day and age. I don't know if you are if you're the children of parents who have immigrated to America back in the 80s, 70s, when there was a huge immigration push from Korea to America. But every single family, I'm sure you have a family member. You have some uncle, some mother, some father, somebody in your distant relatives that came with $50 in their pockets and came to America with $50. Why is it always $50? I swear, my father came with $50. My uncle came with $50. It's never more than $100 in their pockets. I don't know why. Yo, there we go. Hey! Julia, you just answered my question. Why it's never more than $100? It's every immigrant story has $50. I guess because it's the government. Well, thank you very much for explaining that. Wow, that's amazing. All right. Now I gotta research this, and I'm gonna be going down this rabbit hole. But every single immigrant has this story where they came trying to seek a new life, and as they were coming, they had nothing. They only had each other and less than $100. That's all they had. So what was the big boom in America for these Korean Americans, these Koreans who came from overseas and came into this land with nothing? They had to depend on something. And so what was one of the biggest booms for the Korean community? It was the Korean church. It was in the church that people found their identity. It was in the church that people found community. And it was in the church that people had this healthy, truly dependence upon God. As immigrants who had nothing, they had to depend upon each other, and they also had to depend on prayer and God. And that's why a lot of times, if you look at the history of the Korean church, the early morning prayers was such a significant part of people's lives because they wanted to stay connected to God. They needed God. They needed help and a healthy dependence upon Him. And one of the criticisms of the next generation church, the sort of the English ministries or the future generations, is that we've lost a lot of that. In our abundance, in our blessings, in the blessings that God has given, some of the new churches, the future generational churches, have forgotten the struggle of their Asian American parents and why church was such an integral part of their lives. Now, I'm not saying this to knock the next generational church, but what I am saying is there is a danger. There is a danger that once you have more, And once you live in abundance, there is a danger of losing sight of God. And so this healthy dependence, many times God uses our circumstances to help us to be healthily dependent upon Him. And so just like Clement Stone, his major loss, after he had lost everything, he turns his focus from himself to rebuilding the company on the foundation of honoring God. And this is what he states in his book about how he started to really change the culture of his company to being a God-honoring company. And as he started to honor God in the process, you know what ends up happening is that Clement Stone actually becomes even more blessed. Kind of like the story of Job. He becomes more blessed that by 1979, again, his insurance company exceeds $1 billion in assets. And not only that, but he helps churches around the world, and he gives more than hundreds of millions of dollars in charitable funds and to churches. He actually built Crystal Cathedral. I don't know if you've ever visited that church in Los Angeles, but he helped Robert Schuller build Crystal Cathedral by giving him seed money of $1 million, and he helped build that beautiful church, Crystal Cathedral. And so once again, there is the danger of pride, and Clement Stone really understood this. And so he said, I'm going to change my life around and start honoring God. And so finally, we're going to end today's sermon with this, verse 17. As God tells the Israelites, don't forget me, because there is don't forget me, number one. And number two, there is the danger of pride and self-reliance. This is how God ends this passage in verse 17. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms His covenant, which He swore to your ancestors, as it is today. You know, I like this line, this last line where he says, which He swore to your ancestors, as it is today. You know, I've been talking about the Korean church a little bit this morning. And when I look at this congregation, once again, I am so filled with love, gratitude, and thanksgiving to the Lord. I really am. I really mean it when I say, I truly believe I am pastoring the church of some of the greatest people that this city of Denver has to offer. And when I look into this audience, I am so thankful to God that He has blessed every one of us. Nobody in this congregation is, running so poor that we have nothing to eat. We all have shelter over our heads. We all have family members. We all have friends here that we can come and enjoy and love. But many of you also know the sting of heartache. And many of us here know what it's like to grow up poor. Some of your parents, seriously, did come from Korea with only $50 in their pockets, and they had nothing. And so I don't know if you remember, but I know my past and my history. I remember we had to struggle many times, like many of you. But now in 2024, God has really blessed us all. I truly believe this. God has blessed each and every one of us. And when I think about how did that come to be? How did this happen? I thank my grandparents. I thank my parents. I thank the generations before me that were praying on their knees, in the dirt, in Korea, praying for revival, praying for blessing, Praying for, you know that the big North Korean revival came from North Korea, from Pyongyang, and it went down to South Korea. My grandparents are a result of that. They're a result of the blessings. My grandfather became a pastor because of that blessing, that outpouring of North Korea. So I know that there, in all of our, I'm sure that there are ancestors, there are grandparents, there are great-grandparents who have been praying for us, praying that one day, may my future generations be blessed. God, please bless us. We are dirt poor. I mean, there are stories that I still remember my father sharing with me back in the 50s, where Koreans had to eat bark of trees. They would cut the bark off the trees and they would boil it with water just so that they could have some nutrition to eat. And we went from a poor country like that in the 50s to now Korea. Do you know Korea's GDP is like more than 50% of all the other countries in the world? We have an amazing GDP. And I truly believe it was the prayers that our ancestors prayed. And it says, which God swore to your ancestors as it is today. I just want to remind our congregation that we are not here because of our ingenuity, our power, our know-how, our knowledge. Although, yes, we are very smart people in this room. We are very knowledgeable and we have strength in these numbers. But that's not all. That's not the whole story. There were people who were praying for you. There were grandparents who were praying for us. There were family members who helped us along the way. There was a cousin who called us from Colorado Springs to Korea and said, hey, there's this place where there's no Koreans. Golden opportunity. Come to Golden, Colorado. Come to Colorado Springs. There was somebody who did that for us long ago that we can't see right now. But God, when He sees, views your future, He sees everything. And He has put everything together so that you can be here today. Doesn't that deserve gratitude to the Lord our God? Amen? And that is why Moses is telling his people to stay humble, to be thankful, to stay in gratitude, in this posture of gratitude. Never forget that God has blessed us with all these blessings. I want to end with this last verse. I love this. This is Proverbs. And if there's any young people, especially the young ones, the young generation, they always ask me things like, Pastor Howard, how do I become smarter? How do I get more wisdom in life? Well, my always go-to answer is start reading the Proverbs. It is the number one book of all time history that shows the greatest wisdom literature of all time. And this is what the proverb, what the person who wrote the Proverbs, Solomon, says. He says, 2 things I ask of you, Lord. Do not refuse me before I die. Give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. Why? Otherwise, I may have too much and disown you, or basically forget you, and say, who is this Lord? Who is the Lord? Or I may become so poor and steal, and so dishonor the name of my God. This is one of the wisest sayings. This person didn't want too much so that he would forget God, but he didn't want too little that he would start stealing and resolve a life and go into a life of sin. He just wanted to live in God's presence by his dependence, depending upon God. And so my challenge to you, this congregation, this morning, is to practice thankfulness in your own lives. How can we practice thankfulness? No matter what level we are, whether we are rich, whether we are poor, or like what I suspect the majority of us, we're somewhere in between. How can we practice thankfulness throughout this week. And I'm really glad that our praise leader mentioned this really great tactic that you can use this week. What he said, for those who have come late or didn't hear it, he said, sit down with your family this week and write down together all the things, all the ways God has blessed you from January this year up until now. And as you start writing, from January, February, March, all these things until today, I'm telling you, we will be wowed by how much God has helped us, by how much God has supported us, by how much God has been the foundation that undergirded us in times of plenty and in times of want. Let's do that this week and become people who are grateful. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.